Hello and welcome to the National Security Conversation. Senior Pakistani officials have of late been making some rather shocking claims that India is responsible for terror attacks in Pakistan and that they have credible evidence about the Indian involvement in the Army public school attack in 2014. They also argue that in 2019, the Indian embassy funds were used more than $1 million to merge the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan (TTP) with the Jamaat-ul-Ahrar, Harkatul Ansar, and two other terror organizers. So, just to be clear, Pakistan is now accusing India of merging 5 terrorist organizations based within Pakistan. Islamabad has also accused India of sponsoring terror against Pakistan via Afghanistan, using, and I quote, think tanks in Afghanistan as fronts to funnel money to Baloch terrorists in Pakistan. Is there any truth in these shocking allegations? And why are Pakistanis making these claims at this point of time? Is the Imran Khan government trying to deflect attention from its own domestic failures by making these rather wild allegations? More so, given the serious allegations that have been hurled at India, where do India-Pakistan relations go from here? To discuss these issues, I have with me Ambassador Vivek Karju, former Indian ambassador to Afghanistan, and Mr. Tilak Devasher, former Special Secretary in the Cabinet Secretariat, Government of India. So welcome to the National Security Conversation, Ambassador Karju and Mr. Tilak Devasher. If I may begin this conversation with you, Ambassador Karju, let me come to you first. How do you see the Pakistani statement that was recently issued that India sought talks with Pakistan several times, but Pakistan was not keen on getting into a conversation with India? How do you see this statement coming from Islamabad?
I don't think it was a statement. It was a revelation that was made by the Special Assistant to Prime Minister Imran Khan for National Security Division. And he said, or he claimed that India had been making overtures for conversations with Pakistan, and that Pakistan had laid conditions. However, the spokesperson of the External Affairs Ministry denied that any such overture had been made, and I personally would have been very surprised if the government had approached Pakistan to begin talks, because the government's position is very clear. It has been, and I think correctly, that Pakistan should give up the use of terror if it wishes to have talks. And I must say that that Prime Minister Modi, in a manner of speaking, went out of his way to open dialogue with Pakistan, and he visited Lahore in 2015 December. But we know what happened. The Pakistani army then took charge and sabotaged that opening that the Prime Minister and the former Prime Minister of Pakistan, Nawaz Sharif, were trying to make. So let's leave it at that.
But what's the rationale behind this kind of an argument coming, as it were, at this point of time, when things are certainly not great between India and Pakistan? If Pakistan clearly desires talks with India, there is you're a diplomat, you know there's a way of communicating that, and there is a channel of communication for that. But this is not how you do it. But what would be the rationale behind making this kind of a revelation, as you called it, at this point of time?
Well, making this claim, the rationale is purely a propagandist. They are trying to send a message to their people and to sections in India that India has become on the defensive ever since the Prime Minister took steps beginning with last year in the sense of constitutional changes in Jammu and Kashmir. So it is trying to show that Pakistan has the upper hand, and is that Pakistan is now laying down conditions. I, for one, cannot believe this kind of propaganda. Is very crude in any way, and if you've seen, it has got no traction at all once the government of India stated forthrightly that no such overture had been made. The Pakistanis are quiet and no one has taken any notice of this.
So there was let me come to you now. How should India respond to the Pakistan, the rather disturbing, if I may put it that way, Pakistani claim that India is responsible for terror attacks in Pakistan, and they have credible evidence apparently about the Indian involvement. For example, in the army public school attack in 2014, they also make the argument that in 2019, the Indian embassy funds were used more than $1 million US, and I'm quoting here, to effect the merger of the Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan with Jamaatul Ahrar, Harkatul Ansar, and a couple of others. How do you see it, and how should India respond to this kind of a rather disturbing but mindless claim?
No, I don't see why you respond at all. If they had proof that this attack of APS attack took place in 2014, a commission was set up whose report was released recently as late as September 2020. Why are you keeping quiet about it? Why hasn't Pakistan gone to town saying that we have this proof? Why was it not included in the commission report? And why haven't they informed everybody about it? Why is he feeling shy? I didn't think, every time they say India's involved. If you have proof, show it to the world. See, the important thing about the APS commission report, I just want to mention 2 points there. What the report says is that the first responders to the incident were the police, but the police were not allowed to enter till the armed forces came. Second, it was people in the vicinity who facilitated the terrorists, who allowed the terrorists to stay with them and facilitated the attack. So the responsibility and the culpability of the attack of the APS is on Pakistan. This person is trying to shift the blame onto India by showing that India is somehow responsible by an absurd statement. I mean, he claims to be a scholar, an academic. And is this how you talk about it? Again, we're talking about the merger of the TTP with those two organizations that you mentioned. He says in 2019, the Indian mission paid $1 billion. Actually, the merger took place in August 2020. Right? He's got his time totally incorrect. And who announced the merger? Ehsanullah Ehsan, a week or two before the merger actually took place. Who is Ehsanullah Ehsan? He is the man who was the spokesman of the TTP, was involved in the APS attack. He was in Pakistan army custody. And he manages to escape from the army custody and goes where with his family? To Turkey of all the places. And Pakistan could have brought him back to Turkey at any time. So his announcing this clearly shows the complicity of Pakistan itself. How can they blame India for this? So, again, a very convoluted manner. And if you have the proof, I can say a telephone call was made to do this. Do I have any substance to prove? Who will believe it? It's laughable. That's all I can say about this. That both is, and why are they doing this? Then to preempt your next question. They are trying to build a body of evidence. And that's why I think he was so desperate to come on an Indian channel. And they are trying to build a body of evidence of India's equivalence in terrorism so that when India's mutual evaluation takes place with the Financial Action Task Force next year, they will say, look, this, and this. But the game is so transparent and they're so ham-handed in doing things like this, it just doesn't make sense.
Ambassador Kachhu, the problem is this. For almost 33 years or more, India has consistently claimed and accused Pakistan of promoting terrorism on Indian soil, including in Jammu and Kashmir, and rightly so. And suddenly Pakistan has now decided to turn the heat on India and is now making the argument that the Indians are sponsoring terrorism within Pakistan. The problem with that argument, however, there may not be any evidence to it, as Mr. Devashra pointed out. The problem is that once you start making this kind of argument and you repeat it and keep repeating it, it tends to be believed by a lot of people. There is that danger, isn't it, Ambassador Kachhu?
No, there's no such danger, because these arguments can make an impact, provided they are being made by parties or countries that have credibility. Pakistan does not have any credibility, and therefore the international community will judge these arguments as nothing but trying to shift the focus of terrorism onto India and shift the blame to India. No one will get taken in. An earlier attempt has already been made, and that was made in this entire sorry episode of Kulbhushan Jadhav, who was abducted by Pakistan with the sole from Iran, for the sole intention of trying to show that India is engaging in terrorism against Pakistan, espionage and terrorism. And what happened? The international community shrugged it off. They came out with a big fanfare. If you recollect, in 2016, March of 2016, the then DG ISPR, General Asim Bajwa, who these days is being arraigned for corruption, etc. He and I think the information minister of Pakistan came out and they wanted to make a big splash in the world. They in fact accused the Indian intelligence agencies. They named senior officials, and if you see the court documents which are available, that is the International Court of Justice documents, all the correspondence exchange between India and Pakistan. In that too, there is the entire effort is to show that the Indian intelligence is fomenting terrorism in Pakistan. But has the world paid any attention? No. What was the focus? The focus was entirely on Pakistan denying India consular access. So therefore, I come back to this point, and I will emphasize this point, that Pakistan simply has no credibility because the international community fully acknowledges that Pakistan is a center of terrorism. And when they say that India is doing this, they can say this till the cows come home. Nobody is going to believe them. So it's an exercise in futility.
So, Karju, the trouble is this, and we've heard it several times in official circles as well as in various track two meetings of the Pakistani argument that India is using Afghanistan to sponsor terrorism in Pakistan. They keep talking about Indians using and the number goes up every time. 9 consulates, 12 consulates, 15 consulates. The number of consulates keep going up. You've been India's ambassador to Afghanistan. So what do you make of the recent Pakistani accusation that India is sponsoring terrorism against Pakistan via Afghanistan using, and I quote, think tanks in Afghanistan as fronts to funnel money to Baloch terrorists in Afghanistan? I know you've spoken about it in the past, you've written about it, but I think for our viewers, it would be useful as former ambassador to Afghanistan, if you could sort of tell our viewers as to what Pakistan is saying about India's presence in Afghanistan, which the Afghans don't have a problem with, but apparently the Pakistanis have a problem with, and with the return of Taliban to Afghanistan, will these accusations now increase, as it were?
Well, you've asked several questions in one question. Let's take them one by one. The first is about the number of Indian consulates. I think Pakistan was very uneasy when we opened our consulates, especially, or reopened them, especially in Jalalabad and in Kandahar. The 2 new consulates that were opened were in Herat and in Mazar-e-Sharif. President General Musharraf himself complained about the reopening of these consulates to the Afghan government, which simply shrugged it off. No one there believed it, not only within the Afghan system, but also within the coalition forces. So they were left dangling. The second thing is, why are they doing this? They are doing this because they need to find an explanation and a scapegoat, an explanation for their people. After all, the TTP and all these groups that constitute the TTP had close connections with the Pakistan army. This is no secret. Everyone knows that they had close connections. Still, they fell out. And once they fell out, and the Pakistani army started its operations in FATA, then these groups moved across the border into Afghanistan. And this is a matter between the Afghan authorities and Pakistan. India has no presence there. The two consulates are in Jalalabad and Kandahar were not in all across the Durand. The activities were extremely circumscribed. I know it for a fact. And they were performing normal consular activities. So these were all nothing but trying to find an explanation for their own ineptitude in allowing Pakistani groups, Tanzeems with which they had close connections, and who turned against them. The last point that you raised is about the Taliban. What happens when the Taliban come? My own feeling is that once the Taliban come into some kind of power sharing agreement, their instincts would gradually get modified. Because it's one thing to be in a group like this, it's quite another thing to be then participating in government. And they'll have far better appreciation of the situation. It doesn't mean that their connections with Pakistan will snap altogether, but I think they'll get a better perception of things than we'll have. If they are part of the government, we'll be engaging them. So I think I'm not worried about that aspect.
Dr. Khatri, that's a very interesting statement you're making. You're saying that if and when the Taliban becomes part of a power sharing agreement in Afghanistan, India will engage them. I mean, I haven't seen anything from the government to that effect.
If you permit me to say, anyone who is the legitimate government of Afghanistan, please note the word legitimate government of Afghanistan, India has done business with them. The 1996, when the Taliban came in, they were not recognized internationally as the government in Afghanistan. Only 3 countries recognized them: the Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. And the UN seat was kept by the government of President Rabbani. So that was the legitimate government of Afghanistan, and that is the government we dealt with. I dealt with them as an officer dealing with Afghanistan in the Ministry of External Affairs, because it was the legitimate government of Afghanistan. So India has had no problems in dealing with the legitimate government of Afghanistan. And if Taliban are part of a power sharing agreement, then I dare say they will be part of a legitimate system. And at
So it's not the Taliban that we have a problem with. It's the legitimacy, or Taliban's legitimacy, that we'd have a problem with, put differently.
I will not enter into a debate here with you. All that I would say is that if the Taliban are part of a legitimate system of Afghanistan, I see no reason for the government of India to say that we will not deal with someone who is there.
Right. Mr. Devanshu, let me come to you next about the larger picture within Pakistan. Do you get the feeling that Imran Khan's political vulnerability within Pakistan today has something to do with these new claims and revelations, as it were? Is he losing the so-called support that he had from the Pakistan army today? Has that put him in jittery? Is that why we are seeing a lot of these accusations being hurled at India today? Would you read it that way?
Before I talk about Imran Khan, I just want to make one point of your previous question.
Sure.
Having looked at Pakistan for a period of time, one thing that strikes me is that Pakistan would always think that India would do something which they would have done if the situation was reversed. If they were in a position to use Afghan think tanks, they would certainly use it, and therefore they think that India is using Afghan think tanks. The simple question is, why think tanks? Why use think tanks? Before you make a statement, you must see it through, especially an academic, must see it through what's he trying to say. So this is what Pakistan would have done if the situation were reversed. And this is my conclusion. If you look at any sort of activity, their first reaction was, "Bhai, hum to wo karte to India bhi wahi kar raha hai." You know, that's one. Now, you see, Imran Khan's mantra has been for the last 2.5 years that he and the army are on the same page. He said so at every occasion, saying that this is a plus point for his government, which other governments did not enjoy. Now, this is fine. But the fact is that his incompetence and his incapability of dealing, for example, with the economy has now started reflecting on the army, because people say that already if you're on the same page and you're not able to govern, then the army is equally responsible. And Nawaz Sharif has pounced on this and said that this man is incompetent, he can't deliver, but who's responsible for selecting him and bringing him? It is the army. So the attack on the army is now becoming, an attack on Imran Khan is becoming an attack on the establishment, and Nawaz Sharif is directly also targeted the establishment. I am sure that within the army, people are thinking that by sticking so closely with Imran Khan, we are getting tainted. Is this a time to sort of show some sort of a difference or divergence? That's point number one. Point number two is that after a long time, the opposition has managed to come together, which is a huge achievement. PPP and PMLN, which have been at each other's throats for the last 2 decades, have managed to come together on the platform of removing Imran Khan and going for fresh elections, joined by Maulana Fazlur Rahman, and a whole lot of Baloch and Pashtun nationalist parties. So formidable alliance in terms of the people's support that they have. They managed to choose a leader also, Maulana Fazlur Rahman. They have held successful jalsas in Gujranwala and in Karachi. Of course, the Karachi one was also the anniversary of the attack on Benazir Bhutto in 2007. But this has obviously rattled the government. If you see the reaction of the various ministers, it's all knee-jerk and it's almost like panic. This whole incident about arresting Captain Safdar, the husband of Maryam Nawaz, and the ham-handed manner in which it was done, just shows that the government is panicked about the opposition staying together and organizing this huge. It's not that the people love the opposition. Let's be very clear. They are coming to these rallies also because of the inflation, the massive price rise, and the fact that things like wheat and sugar are either not there or very expensive. The prices of utilities have gone up. There's a gas shortage. So all these things have come together, which the opposition is capitalizing upon. And this is what is going to make the army also pause and think. What was actually attempted by using the Rangers to kidnap the police and take him to break down his door, you are actually bringing two institutions, armed institutions, against each other. If the Sindh police had refused, the IG had said, "No, I won't," what would they have done? Have shot him? There could be a possibility where the Sindh police and the army would come, start firing at each other. You have put the federation in confrontation with the province. This is extremely dangerous things that have happened. Therefore, I think Bajwa had to step in.
Right. So, but you are you making the argument that what is happening within the Pakistani political establishment has something to do with these hilarious articulations made by Pakistan at this point of time? Are you making a link at all?
Vis-a-vis India?
Vis-a-vis India?
No, not at all. If you know, I mean, Imran Khan has been making these horrendous statements since August 2019. In fact, even before that, in September 2018, he called Mr. Modi a small man. So it is a constant stream of abuses that he has been hurling, and this incident has started only last month from September onwards. So Imran Khan has gone out on a limb in being very, very critical and hostile. In fact, if I use the term, using gutter language as far as India is concerned.
Ambassador Gadju, Mr. Devashwar mentioned about August 2019. I just want to sort of draw your attention to that. And I mean, personally speaking, I completely understand the liberal Indian opposition to what was done by the government in Kashmir in August 2019. Having said that, I see absolutely, personally speaking, I see absolutely no reason why the Pakistanis should be ballistic about it. And two things happened, as you very well know: the reorganization of the state into 2 union territories and the withdrawal of the special status that was traditionally given to Kashmir in 29, that was given to Jammu and Kashmir. Is it not purely a domestic Indian decision? And why are the Pakistanis up in arms against India on that decision, regarding that decision in 2019?
Let me come to this, but I'll just make one observation. I, for one, don't see as of now great space between Imran Khan and the army. because I don't see the army wanting to come and stage a coup, for example, and take over governance directly as of now. What may happen a month later, one doesn't know. Things will evolve. Second, everyone knows that the Rangers are virtually an arm of the army. Now, is it conceivable that a Ranger chief, the Ranger chief, without the concurrence, if not of General Bajwa, of some senior person, would be party to the virtual abduction of the Sindh Inspector General of Police, the top police functionary of the province? So if that was done, I know Bajwa has ordered an inquiry now, but if that was done, then clearly all that the army is not giving, the army too is wanting to create divisions between the opposition. So I think there's much play in this game, and it's just begun. But as far as your question is concerned, of course it's an internal affair of India. It's entirely within India's domestic jurisdiction, and I've argued this right from August 2019, that all that the Pakistanis needed to do then was to say that they don't accept this. From their viewpoint, if they had said we don't accept it, you can do what you like with regard to constitutional changes, but it does not impact on their stand on Jammu and Kashmir. That stand is a ridiculous stand. But it would not, if they had said that it does not impact on our stand and left it at that, it's over. And this idea that even changes in domicile law, etc., would bring about a demographic change in Kashmir is ludicrous. I mean, this is not the Soviet Union or under Stalin's time that you can move large populations in and out. What are they talking about, the Pakistanis? And that is why you find that no one is paying any attention in the international community to this line which the Pakistanis have taken, except perhaps China and Turkey and Malaysia, maybe under Mahathir. Yes, there has been a focus on the administrative measures that were taken in Jammu and Kashmir after August 5. I'm not going into the merits of all that. Those are domestic matters, but there were some concerns and liberal opinion internationally, and some governments were concerned with this, and they articulated it. And I do think that India has to engage this liberal opinion, and many of these administrative measures are no more there. So that aspect is there. And finally, Pakistan has no locus standi in this matter, because see all that they have done in Pakistan occupied Kashmir and what were called the northern areas. See what they've done. And right from 1963, when under the Sino-Pakistan agreement, they virtually ceded territory of the then state of J&K to China. Do they have after that, from 63, do they have any locus standi to talk about what India has been doing?
Right. Mr. Devaksha, let me come to you with that question. If you could sort of enlighten our viewers on, given the Pakistani, uneasiness about what happened in Jammu and Kashmir in August 2019, what really has happened in POK and Gilgit-Baltistan? What are some of the legal and other changes Pakistan has carried out there, and what is the state of human rights violations in the Pakistani occupied Kashmir and Gilgit-Baltistan? If you could sort of enlighten us.
Before I come to that, the point that Vivek made on the domestic, I agree that the army would not have got a more compliant prime minister than Imran Khan. A man who doesn't think too much. He's allowing them to get away with whatever they want to do. They would not get anybody, neither the PPP nor the PMLN. But the point is that how long will the army allow the mud to stick to them because of his failure? That is the point I was trying to make. I'm not saying now. It could happen in the future. It could happen as it goes along. Because a lot of it is now personally people are blaming Bajwa and the ISI chief. So this is something that we need to watch out. And I don't see either the army coming into a coup-like situation, because look at Pakistan's economy. If politicians and bureaucrats and technocrats can't fix the economy, there's nobody in the Pakistan army. I mean, let's be very clear, who will be able to fix Pakistan's economy. So I'll leave it on that. But yes, on Gilgit-Baltistan, you see, the point is that right since 1947, Pakistan has fooled the world as far as or Gilgit-Baltistan is concerned. Now, two of the main arguments that Pakistan has used as far as India is concerned on Article 370 that lead to changes in demography and its violations of the Security Council resolutions. Now, in the case of Gilgit-Baltistan, the state subject rule has been held in abeyance since 1970s. And this was done deliberately to change the Shia character of the state. And it's been found that there has been, from 1998 to 2011, due to large-scale migration, population of Gilgit-Baltistan has gone up by 63%, as against 20% in POK, so-called Azad Jammu and Kashmir, where the state subject rule was still there. And therefore, the demographic changes have already taken place in Gilgit-Baltistan, which Pakistan is blaming us for doing right now. Secondly, in violation of UN Security Council resolutions, you see, the Karachi Agreement of 1949 is itself a fraud by which Pakistan got control of Gilgit-Baltistan. That itself is a fraud. I won't go into details, but actually the person who's supposed to be one of the signatories, Ibrahim Khan, denied that he'd actually even signed it. Then Pakistan further violated the UN Security Council resolutions in 1963 when it handed over Shakskan Valley to China. Right? And then there have been some baby steps taken from about 1975 onwards to devolve some amount of local self-government. But still the power has always been maintained with Pakistan. Committees have been set up. In fact, the last committee which was set up was in 2016 under pressure from China, which Sartaj Aziz headed. They also concluded that Pakistan cannot become a full-fledged province. At best, you can make it a provisional province by giving them some powers. But the fact of the matter is that the people of Gilgit-Baltistan are denied basic rights, political rights, constitutional rights, as well as civil rights. So Pakistan is really in no position to talk about what is happening in J&K, even what's happening in its own backyard. On human rights, I'll just mention one incident, the case of one human rights activist called Babajar. He was detained in 2011 for organizing a protest of those who had been impacted by landslides in the Hunza River. He was convicted for life under anti-terrorism law. A man who's protesting against landslides is convicted for anti-terrorism law. Recently, you would have heard that the Prime Minister of POK, he was put in a charge sheet for treason against in Lahore when it was against Nawaz Sharif. So this is the kind of so-called azadi which POK has and what has been happening in Gilgit-Baltistan.
Right. Karju Saab, now Mr. Devashu talked about China and Shaksam Valley. I just also wanted to sort of draw your attention to the thickening of the relationship between Pakistan and China. Not that they didn't have a relationship before, they certainly had. But now this is becoming a more thicker alliance in my sort of understanding. And with what China is doing on the line of actual control, how much will this alliance hurt India's interest in the greater Himalayan region, particularly in POK and Leh? And what is it that India should be prepared for in the months and the years to come?
Look, a couple of points. The first is that whereas earlier there was a shared negativity towards India, which was the foundation of the Sino-Pak nexus. I believe today, with the CPEC, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, a positive element has also been added. A positive pillar is there to sustain that relationship. The negativity is still there, but in addition, there is a positive pillar. So I do think that we've got to take this nexus as a fact which will continue for a long, long time. Now, we've got to therefore be prepared for simultaneous action by Pakistan and China. And I do think that our forces are prepared for this. At least that is what the statements that the chiefs of the forces, defense forces, have been making. And I'm sure that our own strategic planners are fully aware of this possibility. Second, I would say, is that as far as the LAC is concerned, I, for one, am convinced that we will have to harden our defenses all along the LAC now. But that's, and my last point here is that I wonder whether at the present juncture, the Chinese realize that if they ask the Pakistanis to come into this game that is going on, or the play that is going on between China and us, whether they will expose their own weakness, that they by themselves are not capable of handling us. So that is a factor which well may prevail in Beijing for the time being. Later on, anything can happen. But for the time being, I think these are the thoughts that have been coming to me.
Right. I have one question which I'll ask both of you before we wind up. We have a couple of more minutes. Mr. Devasher, where do India-Pakistan relations go from here? We are probably, this is probably one of the worst periods in India-Pakistan relations, and things are simply not looking up. Where does the relationship go from here?
I don't think so. It is going to go anywhere. You see, Pakistan has made it categorically clear, Imran Khan, Shah Mahmood Qureshi, everybody has made it clear that unless and until India reverses the decision of 5th August 2019 and the domicile law and a few other conditions, talks are just not possible. I think we are very clear that the government of India is not going to go back on the changes. It's done by Parliament with a lot of consensus. There's no way India is going to go back on that. So there is absolutely no meeting ground. The other thing which I mentioned frequently is the kind of language that Imran Khan has been using against government of India and against the Prime Minister himself. On what basis would he ever expect that India is going to talk? On what basis does he think that India will ever take him seriously? So at the moment, I don't see that there is any possibility at all of the way forward. It's just not going to happen.
Mr. Devasher, the government of India, although made the statement, not certainly, it's nothing to do with Pakistan, but that the statehood of Jammu and Kashmir may eventually be returned when the time is right. So there is a certain possibility that part of the decision may be revoked. And would that be an opening at some level?
I don't think so. I think, you have to, for me, the reason why Pakistan is so het up is that because they perceive, rightly or wrongly, that India's actions has actually hit them where it hurts the most. For 70 years, Pakistan nationalism is built on one slogan, Kashmir Banega Pakistan. Everybody's benefited from it. The army, the politicians, the religious leaders, the public have been fed on this diet of Kashmir Banega Pakistan. Now suddenly they feel, like I said, rightly or wrongly, that India has taken Kashmir off the table, that we've lost Kashmir. So they are hurting a lot. Giving it a statehood, yes, it will be one particular thing. Elections, you're back to normal, politicians are there. But whether, without Article 370 and 35A, whether they'll be willing to accept this as a sop to start negotiations, I am extremely skeptical.
Let me pose that question to you as well, Ambassador Kajju. Where do India-Pakistan relations go from here?
Look, I see a plan which Pakistan has been pursuing, especially since August 5 last year. And that plan is to paint the government of India as a fascist government. Now, they've been consistently pursuing this propaganda line. It hasn't worked, and I doubt whether it will work because Pakistan has a credibility problem. Imran Khan too, and the military too have a credibility problem vis-a-vis the international community. But that doesn't mean that they haven't tried this. And they're pursuing it. So what Tilak says is the kind of gutter language that they are using. Of course, it's gutter language, but it is part of this entire game that they are playing. I don't see any government in India agreeing to talk to Pakistan as long as it is on its present trajectory. Second, if the government acts as it's said that at some stage it might restore statehood to the union territory of what is now the union territory of Jammu and Kashmir, or confer statehood, then the special status will not be restored. And I think Pakistan will not be satisfied with this. In any case, this is part of activities within India's domestic jurisdiction. And let us not forget that the Supreme Court will at some stage hear the case relating to this matter of the constitutional steps which were taken on August 5, 2019. So the Supreme Court will have to weigh in at some stage on the manner in which it was done, if nothing else. So this is not something which will create an opening, to use your words. I myself don't see a possibility of any great change in the India-Pakistan relationship in the near future. I don't see that happening because the Pakistanis have gone on a completely negative track, and they feel that this negative track is yielding them dividends. On Kashmir, as I said, they could have taken the same line that it doesn't impact their case on Kashmir or their stand on Kashmir, but they didn't do so. Partly because they thought that this will in the long term change the demographic dynamics. And they are wrong there. I don't see that changing in any major way. Because Tilak is right when he draws attention to Gilgit-Baltistan. But Gilgit-Baltistan has space. I saw Tilak in way in Gilgit-Baltistan, this kind of demographic change is possible. I don't think it's possible in the Kashmir Valley or in Jammu.
Right. So you are basically, you're essentially saying that it is a purely domestic decision that it is, and Pakistan has absolutely no locus stand either. And if that is going to be holding them back from engaging into a conversation with India, so be it.
It has to be. What else can you do? Look, in any case, before that, were the Pakistanis willing to actually talk on J&K? You can't do talks and terror. That is the line that they were pursuing. And all through, till 2016, if you see, it is till the Uri terrorist attack. Till then, the government was trying, all governments, including the including Prime Minister Modi's government, the Modi one, were trying to hope that Pakistan would see logic and give up terrorism and take seriously to talks, because between two nuclear powers, this kind of a game cannot be played and should not be played.
Fascinating insights. Thank you, gentlemen. It's been wonderful talking to you. Thank you so much, Ambassador Kajju, Mr. Tilak Deveshwar. Thank you once again.
To receive instant updates on all videos from The Wire, click the subscribe button and hit the bell icon. Pay to support independent journalism. Click the link in the description and choose the amount you want to pay.